So before talking about the Korean War itself, it's probably worth noting some of the context, including some of the context concerning the U.S. And so the Korean War is the first major conflict, international conflict more specifically, that occurs after World War II during the Cold War. And what puts a lot of this in perspective is the U.S.'s policy of containment, where they wouldn't necessarily try to directly confront communist countries, but they would try to prevent communism from spreading to new countries. And so, after World War II, or during World War II, Korea was controlled by Japan, and afterwards it was split in influence between the USSR in the north and the US in the south. And so, in August 1948, the Republic of Korea in the south is going to be established as a country, and about a month later, the DPRK is going to be established in the north. And so, the South Korea has strong backing almost initially from the US, but the DPRK doesn't have it that quickly, but it does eventually secure a loan from the USSR with a cultural and labor exchange agreement, including infrastructure, and including such as a railroad that will connect the USSR to North Korea. So, and before the war begins, there's around 10,000 casualties from skirmishes on the border because essentially what each Korea's goal is at this point is to reunify the peninsula. It's just differing on the specifics based on who's backing who, or on who's backing which. Yeah, on who's backing who. Which, and both countries are rightly concerned that the other countries bolstering the. So the U.S. is right to be concerned that the Soviets are backing North Korea, and the Soviets are right to be concerned that the U.S. is backing the South because they are. Because South Korea and North Korea function as very good buffers in the region against the other country. And as I said earlier, both Koreas want to reunify the peninsula, but Kim Il Sung of North Korea is much more pushing of this, and he frequently talks with Stalin and Mao by telegram to confirm their support, but they don't want him to just straight out invade a country because that looks very bad for them. And Kim pushes this as a liberation, and he says that the population in the South will support his army, more or less just to make it more popular with Stalin and Mao. But they want him to specifically wait in response for military action or any threat from the South that warrants this. Which on June 25th, 1950, they start the war with a large-scale artillery bombardment over the border, concentrated on the western and eastern portions, but it's over the whole thing. And then around 100,000, although the real number is probably closer to 70 to 80,000, of KPA soldiers march across the border afterwards. And the South Korean armed forces is around 98,000 at this point. However, they withdraw from the border, but they don't suffer severe casualties. And neither side suffers severe casualties because of their withdrawal. And then later the same day, on June 25th, the UN Security Council calls for a ceasefire, and it tells the member states to halt any assistance to the DPRK. But the USSR was not present for this, and they probably would have countered it in some way, but they were boycotting for a reason we'll see soon, or will come again soon. And on June 25th, the DPRK report that claimed that the South Korean army had pushed past the 30th parallel around 2 kilometers probably was falsified, and it was falsified, more or less just to secure assistance from the USSR and China. So on June 27th, President Truman issues the order for the U.S. to aid South Korean and reinforce their other holdings in the area. And this also is where he is comfortable stating that this shows that communism is going to spread by force now. It's not going to let you choose whether or not you want your country to be communist. And he sees this as a plan by China and the USSR to hurt the US, which kind of is, in all seriousness. However, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 83 authorizes member nations to provide the same aid that the US is to South Korea, although support for South Korea is still widely support for South Korea is still widely based on the US. And this resolution would have been vetoed by the USSR, but they were boycotting because Communist China was not admitted as a member state to the UN. So on June 28th, the KPA will have captured the KPA will have captured Seoul for the first time, and then by September 12th, they're going to have reached their furthest point of advance around the Busan perimeter, which is around 5,000 square miles in the southeastern corner of South Korea. But by the time they reach this, they're not in very good shape. They're around half of their original strength, and they're lacking a lot of essential support components for their army. And even past this point, the USSR is maintaining that South Korea was the first offender and that it's not supportive of foreign intervention in countries. And it points out the US has supported South Korea in fairly open support compared to what the USSR was doing, and it signals that it might need to take military action, although it doesn't in this conflict. And on June 30th, Mao is going to have asked Stalin to advise Kim to negotiate to end this because no other country actually believes that South Korea was the initial aggressor, and this is not looking very popular among many communist countries. So UN reinforcements arrive in early July after earlier coalition forces reinforced the Busan perimeter. And on September 15th, General MacArthur is going to command the assault on Incheon, which is about 150 miles from the Busan perimeter, right next to Seoul, or very close to Seoul. And it was very successful with minimal casualties. And at this same time, coalition forces and South Korean forces are going to make their attack on surrounding KPA forces in the south. And this is also highly successful, and they liberate Seoul on the 25th, and in less than a month they're going to have reclaimed all of South Korea. So on October 7th, this is when UN forces make the fateful decision to push past the 30th parallel and into North Korea. And they capture Pyongyang by the 19th because of the previous weakening of the KPA, Korean People's Army. And the UN forces should have stopped at the 38th parallel. This was the best way because that follows with containment. But MacArthur had pushed Truman to push a resolution in the UN that called for the destruction of the KPA and the reunification of Korea under a democratic system. And this requires them to push the border with China on the Yalu River. So the US assures China that UN forces are going to stop at the border. They're not going to invade China. This is just about reunifying Korea. However, China is going to say that any forces past the 38th parallel will be seen as a threat. And on November 24th, when the UN forces reach the Yalu River, they're met by Chinese People Volunteer Army forces, and they inflict heavy casualties on the leading UN units, and this forces their retreat to the southern bank of the Changchun River, which I've marked in red. So, by December 5th, the CPVF and the KPA had recaptured Pyongyang, and by the 6th, they're going to have force the almost complete retreat of UN forces, which are mostly US soldiers, and their attached Korean units past the 30th parallel. However, what's notable is the fighting retreat from the Chosin Reservoir to the port at Hangnam, and 2 CPVF army groups were tasked to destroy them, which is what the actual terminology they use is destroy, but they were only able to make them retreat past the 30th parallel, and they suffered around 67% casualties of their 120,000 man fighting force, most of which was concentrated in one of the army groups, so it was incapacitated for a long while. And when all is said and done, a stalemate is going to have set in by December 25th at the 30th parallel. However, the CPVF and the KPA do manage to capture Seoul again by January 4th, 1951, but they'll lose it by March 14th. And by April 11th, Truman, after having relieved MacArthur by the command, he will have relieved MacArthur of the command of the UN forces in Korea, and he's going to be replaced by Lieutenant General Ridgway. By the 25th, the UN coalition is going to have checked the advance of CPVF and KPA forces almost completely at the battles of Kapyong and the Yumjin River. And the Battle of the Yumjin River has particularly high casualties among UN forces, but this allows the UN to solidify their defensive positioning around Seoul. And after this, there's not much back and forth movement. From here to the end of the war, it's mostly looks the same as it does now. On June 23rd of 1951, the Soviet Union is going to call for peace talks to end the fighting, and they're going to begin on July 10th at Kaesong and later move to Panmunjom. But a prolonged lack of progress due to a disagreement on the repatriation of prisoners of war is going to cause the UN delegation to call an indefinite recess on October 8th, 1952. And this repatriation disagreement results by the end of the war in around less than 21,000 soldiers not being repatriated, which the vast majority are Chinese and North Korean. And the armistice talks then actually end the war began on April 26th in 1953. And at 10 a.m. on July 27th, 1953, delegates from the UN, China, and the DPRK signed the armistice agreement, which ends the war, establishes the DMZ, and it gives both sides some time to remove their forces from the ceasefire line. What's notable is no representative from South Korea signs the agreement, so the conflict is still ongoing, technically. And so during the war, the huge majority of deaths were civilian, and it can get difficult to estimate the exact number of casualties, but the number of casualties and those displaced for civilians individually both number in the millions in all likelihood. However, the Chinese numbers, and specifically for their counted casualties, has a wide ranging depending on the year you get your numbers from and where, and it ranges from not much, around 500,000, to over a million, or about a million. However, the DPRK was hit the hardest by far in almost every term, or in most terms, and their casualty estimates around 600,000, which is the most in relative and in absolute terms, depending on what other numbers you use. And estimates place around 90% of all structures in North Korea as damaged or destroyed, which is epitomized by a bombing attack on Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, that involved around 1,400 UN aircraft. And by the end of the war, they will have almost no ability to generate power to power their own country. So that's the immediate aftermath. In modern day, since the war is still ongoing, there's still a good amount of hostility between North and South Korea. But on April 27th, 2018, President Moon Jae-in for South Korea and Chairman Kim Jong-un for North Korea did meet at the third Inter-Korean Summit to discuss denuclearization and reunification in a general term. And this summit results in the Panmunjom Declaration, which does exactly that. It's them stating that they're going to try and end the conflict formally and denuclearize the peninsula, because while South Korea does not have any nuclear weapons, North Korea does, and they're improving their arsenal every year. And then throughout 2018 and 2019, there were 3 similar summits between President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and these summits mostly focused on denuclearization and the removal of economic sanctions imposed by the U.S. on North Korea, mostly as a result of the nuclear developments. And these were generally well received in South Korea, but the DPRK, well, I guess I should say that these don't amount to much. Not much comes out of these specific summits. And the DPRK state news outlets report these as extremely one-sided, but that Kim Jong-un is open to more meetings if more reasonable terms are presented. Okay. So going back to the actual war, what's probably most important to notice is that, or to take note of, is that this was the identity creating moment for the US in the Cold War, because this was the first time that the US was actually able to do something dramatic, for lack of a better word, about communism. And for that reason, it was very popular in the US. And you can kind of see that where there are some mistakes about, there are some mistakes made. Where was that slide? About policy and tactics, and this, like, pushing past the Fayetteville was probably a huge blunder on the part of the U.S. because it prolongs the war for quite a long while, around 2-3-ish years, depending on how the dates work out. But so it prolongs the war by around 2-3-ish years, and you see similar things at the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. But in the Vietnam War, for comparison, the U.S. completely draws out of the war once it looks like it's going to be a little back and forth, or they actually start losing in a dramatic fashion. So yes, overall, the Korean War was kind of an identity-shaping moment for the U.S. for the Cold War, and back to modern times, it does greatly affect relations between the U.S. and the DPRK, mostly because of the U.S.'s extreme intervention. Well, not necessarily extreme, but the large majority of all support for the U.S. was U.S. So a lot of native North Koreans see the U.S. as a larger contributor to the problems that are occurring now. So yeah, that's about it.